Yeah, I think my dad really enjoys it. He's been a mechanic his whole life. I think he enjoys the job satisfaction of it when the car's finished and done, but he genuinely just hates cars.
There are YouTube channels you watch for the cars. Then there are YouTube channels you watch because something about them feels genuinely real. Matt Armstrong's channel has always lived in that second category, and for a long time, most people could not quite explain why. The builds were impressive, sure. The restorations were detailed and ambitious. But something else kept pulling viewers back, something warmer and harder to find. For anyone who has followed the channel long enough, the answer was never really a mystery. It was always Tony. Tony Armstrong, Matt's father, has been a quiet but constant presence throughout the channel's rise. Not in a loud or attention-seeking way, but in a way that only a father who genuinely knows his craft can be. He shows up in the workshop. He leans over an engine bay and says something that changes the direction of the whole project. He spots the thing nobody else noticed, mentions it calmly, and then steps back. For years, audiences watched this dynamic unfold and found themselves wondering about the real story behind it. How much of what happened on screen was real? How much of Matt's success was built on his own hands? And how much came from having a father with decades of automotive experience standing just off camera? Those questions circulated for a long time without clear answers. People speculated. Some gave Tony full credit and suggested Matt was essentially a face for his father's knowledge. Others dismissed Tony's involvement entirely and said Matt had built everything independently. The truth, as it almost always is, sat somewhere more interesting than either extreme. And recently, Tony finally decided to address it directly. The speculation about Matt Armstrong's early career began long before the channel reached the kind of numbers that attract serious attention. In the automotive community around Leicester, conversations started quietly. People who knew the family, knew the garage, and knew the local scene had their own versions of the story. As the channel grew and the audience expanded, those local conversations became online discussions. And online discussions have a way of becoming something much louder than anyone originally intended. The central question was always about credit. When a young creator starts producing rebuild content at a level that impresses seasoned mechanics, people naturally wonder where the knowledge comes from. When that young creator happens to have a father who spent his career working on cars, the assumptions right themselves. Critics suggested that Tony was doing the difficult diagnostic work while Matt presented it on camera. Others believed that the garage itself, the tools, the space, the established relationships with part suppliers, gave Matt an unfair head start that most automotive creators simply do not have access to. What made these rumors stick was the fact that they were not entirely without logic. Automotive work is genuinely expensive. Workspace is genuinely hard to come by. Experience matters enormously when something goes wrong with a complex vehicle. All of those things are true. The mistake was assuming that access to experience automatically means the learning never happened, or that proximity to knowledge is the same thing as receiving it for free. Tony's account of those early years paints a very different picture. According to Tony, Matt was never handed anything in the way people assumed. Yes, the garage was available as a place to work and learn. Yes, advice was given when problems appeared. But the work itself stayed with Matt. Tools were in Matt's hands. Decisions were Matt's to make. When something went wrong, which it did, regularly, the lessons that followed were real ones, not shortcuts around the problem. That is a distinction that matters enormously in any trade, but especially in automotive work, where the difference between understanding something and simply being told the answer shows up very quickly the next time a similar problem appears. Tony also spoke about something that tends to get overlooked in the narrative about Matt's rise, which is how hard Matt actually worked during the years before the channel became successful. The assumption from the outside was that the family connection smoothed over the financial difficulty of starting out. The reality was considerably less comfortable than that. During the years when Matt was building his skills and trying to figure out what direction his life was going to take, work came from wherever it could be found. Food delivery, bar work, automotive retail. Time spent in tuning shops learning the practical side of the industry from people who had no particular obligation to be patient or generous with their knowledge. None of that has the romantic simplicity of a father handing a son the keys to a successful operation. It was ordinary, unglamorous work done because the bills existed regardless of what ambitions were being pursued on the side. Tony's point in sharing this was not to generate sympathy. It was to correct a fundamental misunderstanding about what the early years actually looked like. The garage was a place to develop skills, not a place to avoid developing them. That difference might seem subtle from the outside, but anyone who has worked in a trade understands it immediately. There is an enormous gap between being around expertise and actually acquiring it, and closing that gap requires a kind of repetitive, sometimes frustrating effort that cannot be inherited or gifted. What Tony confirmed about his own role is also worth examining carefully, because it does not fit neatly into either of the narratives that had developed around the channel. He was not absent. He was not secretly doing everything. What he was consistently was present in the way that experienced mentors are present, which is to say available, observant, and willing to speak when speaking was genuinely useful. The distinction Tony draws is between guidance and replacement. When Matt encountered a problem he had not seen before, Tony would explain the likely causes, suggest what to check, and offer the kind of directional thinking that only comes from having seen similar problems many times across many different vehicles. But the actual process of diagnosing, attempting, adjusting, and resolving stayed with Matt. Tony was not there to take over when things got complicated. Tony was there to make sure complications produced learning rather than just frustration. This is, if you think about it, exactly how good mentorship works in any skill field. The mentor's job is not to eliminate difficulty, but to make difficulty productive. A mechanic who solves every problem for an apprentice produces someone who can watch problems being solved. A mentor who guides an apprentice through solving problems themselves produces someone who can actually do it. The difference in outcome is total, and it takes years to become apparent, which is probably why the audience watching from outside could not easily distinguish between the two during Matt's early videos. The progression of quality across those early projects is actually the clearest evidence of how the learning happened. If Tony had been carrying the technical weight, while Matt presented, the work would have looked consistently competent from the beginning. Instead, the videos show exactly what genuine skill development looks like, which is uneven, improving, occasionally surprising in both directions, and gradually more confident over time. That kind of art cannot be faked, and it cannot be produced by someone else doing the difficult parts off camera. The collaborative projects that came later, the bigger builds, the more ambitious restorations, the vehicles that would have been genuinely daunting for most experienced mechanics, introduced a different dynamic. By that point, Matt had developed real capability, and the partnership with Tony shifted accordingly. Rather than the mentor and learner structure of the early years, the work became genuinely collaborative in a way that two capable people with different strengths working on a shared problem is collaborative. Tony brings something to those builds that cannot be replicated by enthusiasm or research. Decades of direct experience with cars, with the particular ways they fail and the particular logic of their repair, creates a kind of pattern recognition that simply takes time to develop. When something unexpected appears in a restoration, Tony often recognizes it from something he encountered years earlier under completely different circumstances. That recognition saves time, prevents costly mistakes, and sometimes changes the entire direction of a project. Matt brings something different and equally essential. The ability to communicate what is happening to an audience that cares about following along requires a completely separate skill set from the mechanical work itself. Knowing which moments matter, how to explain a complex process without losing people, how to make the frustrating parts of a difficult restoration feel like part of the story worth watching rather than just problems in need of solving. All of that is craft in its own right, and it is craft that Matt developed through years of experimentation and feedback from a growing audience. When both of those skill sets are present and genuinely engaged, the result is something that neither person could produce alone. Tony, without Matt's communication ability, would be an experienced mechanic working in a garage, which is valuable but not a YouTube channel with millions of invested followers. Matt, without Tony's depth of experience, would be a capable presenter working at the edge of his knowledge and occasionally getting stuck in ways that a more experienced hand could resolve quickly. Together, they produce something that feels both technically credible and genuinely watchable, which is rarer than it sounds. The moment that perhaps best illustrated the real nature of their relationship happened in 2025, when Matt decided to rebuild a flood-damaged Aston Martin DBX as a surprise gift for his father. The choice of project was not accidental. A luxury SUV with serious water damage represented exactly the kind of challenge that requires both mechanical competence and the willingness to commit to something that might not work out. It was not a safe choice. It was a meaningful one. The fact that Matt chose to take on something difficult as a way of expressing gratitude said something important about how the relationship had developed over the years. This was not the gesture of someone who felt he owed his success to his father in a transactional sense. It was a gesture of someone who understood what genuine support had meant during the years when nothing was certain, and who wanted to honor that with something that required real effort and real risk. The response from the audience when that video appeared was striking. More than 6 million views gathered on a project that was, at its core, about a son rebuilding a car for his father. That number reflects something beyond interest in the vehicle itself. It reflects the accumulated trust that an audience develops when they have watched a relationship develop honestly over years of footage. People were not watching to see whether the Aston Martin could be saved. People were watching because they had come to care about the people working on it. And that kind of investment does not happen by accident or by production strategy. It happens because the relationship being shown is genuine. Tony's willingness to finally address the rumors directly is itself revealing. For years, the speculation existed, and Tony did not feel the need to respond to it. That restraint is consistent with everything about how Tony operates on camera, which is to show up when the work requires it and step back when it does not. The decision to speak out now suggests that the misinformation had reached a point where silence was beginning to allow a genuinely false picture to solidify. What Tony confirmed is not exactly what either camp of speculation expected. He did not confirm that Matt built everything alone, and that the father-son dynamic was purely incidental to the channel's success. He also did not confirm that Tony's experience was a hidden engine behind everything viewers were watching. What he confirmed was a genuine partnership between two people with different strengths, built over many years on a foundation of mutual respect and honest hard work. That confirmation matters because it corrects a tendency that shows up frequently when audiences try to understand creative success. The instinct is to find one explanation, one source, one reason. Either the creator did it alone, which is an inspiring story, or the creator had help, which is a less inspiring story. The actual situation is almost always more complicated and, honestly, more interesting. Two people with genuinely different abilities contributing to something that neither could build alone is not a story of advantage or deception. It is a story of how skilled collaboration actually works. The automotive YouTube space is crowded with channels that follow predictable formats. Cars are sourced, rebuilt, and presented according to a structure that audiences recognize immediately. What separates the channels that develop genuine, lasting audiences from the ones that plateau and fade is usually not the quality of the cars, or even the quality of the technical work. It is whether the people on screen feel real. Matt Armstrong's channel developed the kind of audience that is because Tony Armstrong showed up as himself, not as a character designed to add authenticity, but as an actual person with actual opinions, actual expertise, and an actual relationship with the person he was working alongside. You cannot manufacture that. You can hire experienced mechanics as consultants and put them on camera, but the result looks exactly like what it is. The dynamic between Matt and Tony looks the way it does because it developed over decades before anyone started filming it. What Tony has finally confirmed is that this dynamic was always exactly what appeared to be, not a production decision, not a strategy for audience retention, not a way of borrowing credibility from someone with more experience. A father and son who genuinely work well together, who bring genuinely different things to share projects, and who built something together the same slow, honest way that anything worth building gets made. For the audience that has been watching and wondering, that confirmation changes very little about what they have already seen. But it does give a name and a shape to something that probably felt true all along. The reason Matt Armstrong's channel feels different from most automotive content is not the cars, not the production quality, and not any single element that can be isolated and copied. It is a relationship at the center of it, and that relationship, as Tony has now confirmed, is exactly as real as it always looked. That is the thing about genuine partnerships. They do not need to be defended very often, because the evidence is visible in everything they produce. The work shows what the words only confirm.